This short lecture will introduce some short stories by Franz Kafka, who wrote at the start of the 20th century in German. I'll aim to draw some contrast between the style in which Kafka wrote and more traditional ways of telling stories. To understand Kafka's writings better, it's helpful to see his stories in the context of wider literary and artistic movements around the start of the 20th century. At that time, writers and artists found new ways of exploring the self in the context of new ideas about consciousness. I'm going to make a link to contemporary ideas about the language of dreams and how they offer an insight into the unconscious self. In this way, we can see how Kafka's stories explore the complexity of the inner self and draw attention to some of our conflicting and ambivalent emotions which might not be fully known to our conscious minds. Modernism is an artistic movement that arose at the end of the 19th century. Society was being transformed at that time by industrialisation and the growth of the cities. New scientific and philosophical ideas changed the way people thought about themselves. Rapidly changing gender roles also had an effect on how people understood their sexuality. So around 1900, new technologies and new ideas were shaping the impression of living in an age which promised great freedoms from old ways of life. But at the same time, the loss of some of these old certainties had an unsettling effect. In the visual arts, abstract art offered a way of experimenting with form to try to convey the impression of modernity and its effect on the individual. In literature too, writers started to turn away from representing characters and the outside world realistically. Writers shunned tradition, and particularly important for our purposes is that novelists rejected the authority provided by conventional narrators of fiction. Narrators tend to show us how we should read a novel. They give us some certainty regarding characters' authenticity or integrity. Perhaps they even give us the impression of inhabiting the same space as the reader and the characters, real places which we could visit. We call such narrators omniscient or all-knowing. We use this word if they're in control of the story and they know more than the characters. Without an omniscient narrator, we're left to make up our mind whether the perspective we're offered in the story is reliable. And we might find that unexpected events take place without explanation. These new ways of writing stories are experimental. They respond to new ideas about the complexity of human emotions, consciousness, and the self. They often confront us with the messy and uncomfortable emotions which lie buried deep within the self. And these new ways of writing shape new ways of reading. Without the authority of an omniscient narrator, there's no one single right way of reading such texts and their imagery. In fact, there isn't even a particular message to decode. It's much more that the way the stories are written give us insights into the characters' minds. Whether we're thinking of writing by Kafka or by authors such as Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, the narrative styles used in modernist fiction allow us to explore the complex ways in which our minds work and in which we relate to others. I'm going to turn now to one of Kafka's very short stories, Eine kaiserliche Botschaft, written in 1917 and published in a collection of short stories in 1920. On the worksheet which accompanies this lecture, I've provided the text in full, so you can read it yourself. It's not much more than 300 words. You might want to read it before you carry on listening to this lecture. I've also given you a link to a translation into English. Kafka's stories have been translated many times. And you could also produce your own translation or search for other translations and ask yourself why different translators have made different stylistic choices. The opening sentence, shown on the slide, shows us that the story is directly addressed to the reader, using the informal pronoun du. In fact, the reader has been singled out. Gerade dir hat der Kaiser von seinem Sterbebett aus eine Botschaft gesendet. The phrase gerade dir is emphatic, and it means it is to you in particular that it has been sent, or it has been sent just to you. The emperor has sent a message from his deathbed intended for you, the reader alone. However, the inclusion of the phrase so heißt es, which means apparently or so they say, distances the voice telling the story from the story itself, as if we're dealing with a mere report. It introduces a degree of uncertainty. And what is the message, which is so important that the emperor makes the messenger repeat it back to him? Well, we will never know what the message was. This is a story which is fundamentally about the problem of communication. The narrator begins by using the past tense of storytelling, but then shifts into the present tense as the messenger struggles to escape the crowds which prevent him from making any progress on his journey. There's a powerful immediacy created by the use of the present tense description of the messenger as strong and tireless, but forcing himself through the innermost chambers of the palace. Immer noch zwängt sich durch die Gemächer des innersten Palastes. There is then a move to the conditional, as the narrator suggests the powerful desire of the messenger to bring the message to the reader's door. If only he had the space to move. Öffnete sich freies Feld, wie würde fliegen? Und bald wohl hörtest du das herrliche Schlagen seiner Fäuste an deiner Tür. The inverted word order of the phrase öffnete sich freies Feld is a stylistic device often found in literature which stands in for a more familiar then clause, if there were an open field or if an open field stood before him. This is followed up by more conditional sentences that suggest the futility of the messenger's attempts. Even if he did manage this, nothing would be achieved. The repetition of this phrase, gelänge ihm dies, nichts wäre gewonnen, makes clear that the messenger will remain trapped in the palace and never fight his way through its staircases or its courtyards. This will go on for thousands of years, we're told, and nobody could get through, particularly not with the message of a dead man. So the message in the end cannot be conveyed, but instead, you, the reader, need to dream it for yourself. Du aber sitzt an deinem Fenster und erträumst sie dir, wenn der Abend kommt. We can think about the story in different ways. The emperor, a powerful figure, could represent the mythical father who is the guardian of the law, who represents the social code which regulates our behaviour, against which we measure ourselves and our successes. That might fit with the impossibility of the task and its very public nature. But one thing is very important. The story is presented as a parable. It looks as if it might have a particular meaning for us, and yet its meaning is not clear at all. It suggests that the message to be conveyed must be important because it is handed on by the emperor. Its truthfulness is guaranteed for us by the messenger who has repeated it back and will pass it on in person. But none of this helps. The reader, the du, longs for a meaning, but none of it is forthcoming. The dream has to stand in as a substitute for an absent reality. In this respect, the story can quite legitimately mean different things for different readers. And it helps us recognise that the reader plays a key role in modernist fiction. It's close reading that helps us build up a sense of what the story means to us. It's not about decoding a particular message. And from a stylistic point of view, the story reads a little like a dream. The way the story focuses on the messenger who encounters obstacle after obstacle is is reminiscent of an anxiety dream in which we're set an impossible task. That is a good link to our next story, Kafka's Ein Landarzt, a country doctor, in which a doctor is called to an impossible task in the middle of the night. But first, it's helpful to mention the significance of dreams for the Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud, who founded the discipline of psychoanalysis. Freud treated patients whose physical symptoms appeared to have their origins in conditions of the mind. And in his medical practice, he used the treatment known as the talking cure to understand better the workings of the minds of his patients. This included his patients talking about their dreams, which Freud saw as the royal road to the unconscious. He argued that symbolism in dreams and the language used to describe them offered an insight into the innermost desires of the patient, in particular, sexual desires, which had been shunned by the conscious self. They had been repressed and locked away in the depths of the mind, which Freud referred to as the unconscious. He argued that the language used in dreams could be translated to understand those desires better. In broad terms, Freud was suggesting that there are thoughts and emotions in our minds of which we're not fully aware, which we do not even want to own. These have an important bearing on our behaviour, or even on our body language. Freud's understanding of the mind can be illustrated by this quotation about a horse and its rider from his new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. Freud uses the term the ego, or in German simply das Ich, for the conscious mind, and the id, or das Es, for the primal, instinctual part of the mind that contains the sexual drives. Freud suggests here, to quote, that one might compare the relation of the ego to the id with that between a rider and his horse. The rider is normally in control of a horse. Plato, for example, had used the image of a horse as standing in for human emotions and had suggested that they were controlled by human reason, symbolised by the rider. But for Freud, the horse is a powerful force. It symbolises the basic instincts or drives which are located in the unconscious mind and not fully controlled by the ego. They can be a powerful motivating factor, and all the more so if we do not acknowledge them. In Kafka's story Ein Landarzt, written in 1917 and published alongside Eine Kaiserliche Botschaft, horses appear from start to finish. The story is told in the first person, opening with the striking statement, Ich war in großer Verlegenheit. The perspective from which the story is told then clearly belongs to the Ich, who we learn is the country doctor of the title. Michael Hoffman's powerful translation of the story begins, I was in a quandary, but it's worth noting that verlegen also means embarrassed. Eine Verlegenheit could mean an embarrassing difficulty. The dilemma or quandary here is of a doctor called to a patient in the middle of the night, with his carriage and bag ready and waiting, but without a horse to pull the carriage. Aber das Pferd fehlte. Das Pferd. So, like the messenger who could not deliver the message, the doctor cannot fulfill his obligations, and his maid makes urgent inquiries in the village to see if there is a horse to be borrowed. Already there is a dreamlike or nightmarish quality to the story, an urgent task, the seeming impossibility of fulfilling it. But now the story takes a new turn because horses suddenly appear, along with a blue-eyed groom who comes out on all fours from a pigsty which has not been used for years. What is more, the groom, when offered assistance by the maid, takes hold of her and sinks his teeth into her cheek in an unmistakably sexual gesture. The doctor responds by calling him du Vieh, you animal, and asking if he wants a taste of his whip. Doctors are associated with science, reason, perhaps also respectability. Here the groom, tending to the horses, is associated with the primal sexual desires within the human, with desires that the doctor keeps under wraps. In the groom, these desires are given free rein, and we might ask ourselves whether the groom is the psychic double of the doctor, an alter ego or second self, who makes visible the desires which the doctor keeps hidden away. Later in the story, the doctor, when tending to the patient, keeps thinking about the maid, whose name is Rosa, and refers to the unbeherrschbare Pferde, pulling his carriage. The doctor cannot control the horses then, which the story associates with unruly inner desires. In a twist which we recognise as having no place in a traditional story, the horses escape from their reins, and when the doctor is attempting to treat the patient, a boy, their heads appear through the window. They're an intrusive presence, acting as spectators. They whinny as the doctor tries to treat the boy. In this story, things and people do not behave as they would in the world we feel we all inhabit and know. Instead, there's an absurd quality to what happens. It's the stuff of dreams. It's an avant-garde story in which the associations words take on give us an insight into the inner insecurities and hidden sexual desires of the doctor. The doctor has come to treat a boy before the watching eyes of his family. At first, the doctor pronounces his patient well, and then his thoughts veer back to Rosa, the maid. He discovers a wound in the boy's side, which is symbolically linked to the maid, Rosa, because it is described as having the colour rosa, pink. And suddenly, not only does the doctor consider the boy's fate more serious, but also his own fate. There's a strange affinity between the doctor and the boy. The doctor himself seems beyond saving. He ends the story naked, exposed to the cold night, and driven away in his carriage by unirdische Pferde, horses which are not realistic, but seem almost mythological. The style of this story is as important as what happens. Through the style in which it is written, we're given insights into the doctor's consciousness, and the dream-like logic reveals hidden connections. We need to read closely to uncover these connections, and ideally, we need to read in German, since the associations of the words are so important, and they're not always fully conveyed in translation. The word Pferdeknecht, for example, emphasises more strongly the connection to the horses than the English word groom. And Michael Hoffman's excellent translation cannot preserve the symbolic connection between the maid, Rosa, and the pink wound. Dreams play a role in other German fiction of the early 20th century, such as the dream sequence in Hermann Hesse's novel Der Steppenwolf, which was once widely read in English translation, or Schnitzler's Traumnovelle, which inspired the film Eyes Wide Shut. The technique of word association is very important in a wider sense in modernist fiction in all languages. Authors use it to experiment with different styles in order to explore the consciousness of their characters. We might think of the stream of consciousness used in Lucy Ellmann's novel from 2019, Duck's Newburyport. Whether you read in German or in English or one of the other languages that you know, keep a lookout for experimental forms of narrative and think about how they make us adapt our ways of reading. and offer us new insights into how our minds work. If you want to find out more about this topic, you can check out the worksheet which accompanies this lecture. And you could also try out some of the further reading, whether in German or in English translation. Please also take a look at our website for more information about modern languages courses at Cambridge. Thank you very much for listening.